Okay, our next speaker is Dr. Michael Meyer. We're very fortunate to have him here today and very grateful. And I do mean fortunate because he did travel through Chicago. And if you know what's going on there, it's a little scary. So, yeah, we're really grateful to Mike for coming out. He is currently a senior advisor to Parsons Brinckerhoff. He's got a very rich career. Prior to that, from 1988 to 2012, he was a professor of civil environmental engineering and director of the Georgia Transportation Institute at the Georgia Institute of Technology. From 1983 to 1988, Dr. Meyer was director of transportation planning and development for Massachusetts, where he was responsible for statewide planning, project development, traffic engineering, and transportation research. And then prior to that, he was actually a professor at MIT, where he received his PhD in 1978. Dr. Meyer has been very active in research. He has numerous publications, well over 200 technical articles, has participated in several textbooks and important reports. In fact, he was a principal author of NCHRP 750, which is, I believe, a fairly recently published volume on climate adaptations and the nation's highway system. And he's also been the recipient of numerous awards. So we are very grateful and very pleased to have Dr. Michael Meyer here today. Okay. You can use the page down.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you very much. Coming through Chicago, I actually did not come through Chicago, but now I am using that as an example of a highly vulnerable system that has high-risk consequences when, in fact, an infrastructure system goes down. I won't even bother to tell you what I did to get here today. So I am going to talk about transportation asset management and extreme weather. And clearly there are examples in the recent history in the United States where extreme weather events have had some pretty damaging impacts on our transportation system. I don't mean to downplay in any way the impacts on people's lives and on people. I understand that, but I'm going to be focusing on the infrastructure side. Certainly Hurricane Katrina in the Gulf Coast had serious impacts in terms of damage to the nation's infrastructure in that particular area. Hurricane Irene on the right-hand side is Vermont, on the left-hand side is North Carolina, as it went up the East Coast and the impact on the transportation system. I'm sure you remember what happened in Vermont in terms of the roads and rail and transit systems in Vermont that were basically destroyed because of Hurricane Irene. And then, of course, Superstorm Sandy in recent years had not only impact on the road system, but was really, in my field, one of the first ones that truly had an effect on one of our nation's largest transit systems that had an impact, obviously, economic consequences to New York City, New Jersey, and Connecticut. So there are certainly examples from around the country that really reflect what's happening. Now, I wanted to get away from the coast. I've given a lot of talks over the past 5 years or so on extreme weather events, climate change, and transportation. And in fact, I gave a talk several years ago at a state nearby here, Kansas, where the Kansas Department of Transportation Secretary, who was a friend of mine, stood up after my talk and said, well, you're just talking about coastal issues, storm surge, sea level rise. We don't have that in Kansas. You know, you have no meaning whatsoever for us in Kansas. And says, well, you don't have a coast yet. But someday you know. She didn't laugh. So the point is that there are obviously, other than storm surge and sea level rise issues in the Midwest and in the central part of our country as well. This is Tennessee, that does not have a coast, but had a super flood in 2010, and the impact on infrastructure, as you can see, was rather severe. And so these extreme weather events really have an impact on transportation in many ways. Over the longer term, when you start looking at climate change and what impact temperature change, precipitation change, drought, wind, wildfires, etc., transportation also is a system that's going to be heavily affected. I chose the slides here on purpose for our geotechnical friends with regard to slope stability and some of the issues of precipitation, and these are real-world examples and pictures from Washington State and other places where, in fact, because of more saturation and other issues, the slopes the stability deteriorated. Jerry mentioned NCHRP, National Cooperative Highway Research Program, Report 750, which came out a couple months ago. In the transportation field currently, that probably is the most up-to-date guidebook to practitioners in the United States with regard to what you can think about with regard to extreme weather events, climate change, and transportation. This is the working definition that we used in that report, which looks at what we mean by adaptation of the transportation system, and I've taken the liberty of highlighting in red some of the key words with regard to avoid or withstand or take advantage of some of these threats that we're likely going to see. And I think importantly, the three phrases here: system vulnerability, risk, and resilience. And you heard those earlier with regard to one of the center's themes, I believe, that came out of federal legislation, that really is the intent of a lot of the transportation engineering focus now on what this all means to the transportation systems. How do we incorporate system resiliency and risk analysis into our infrastructure design and maintenance and operation side of things? So when you look at asset management and you look at how you manage your assets and relate it to issues like extreme weather events, what we're looking at now in many parts of the country are 5 important concepts. One is criticality. You can't possibly look at Oklahoma's transportation system or Georgia's transportation system and say everything is important and we have to protect everything. We just don't have the resources to do so, and probably don't have the personnel and the time to do so. And so the question is, how do you identify the critical assets that are important for whatever reasons, for economical purposes, for emergency evacuation purposes, whatever? What are the climate change related stresses, extreme weather stresses that are going to affect those particular critical facilities? What's the extent of exposure of those assets to those particular threats? What is the level of vulnerability, which is truly an engineering issue, which is will the bridge, will the culvert, will the road, will the airport, will the transit facility withstand those additional stresses? And then what is the adaptive capacity of that asset as it relates to trying to recover from or to withstand those particular stresses? I don't have time to go through each one of these, but I am going to provide a couple examples for several of them. There is a Federal Highway Administration study called the Gulf Coast 2 project in the Gulf Coast in Mobile, Alabama. Follows the Gulf Coast 1 study, which was the entire Gulf Coast, where Parsons Brinkerhoff and others are involved with that particular study. And one of the things that we were responsible for was looking at how do you identify vulnerability and how do you look at the criticality aspects of the assets in Mobile, Alabama. Now, this gets back to the issue earlier in terms of the human behavioral issue, which I was in government. I was in government for 5 years. You go and talk to people, everything is important. The road that serves Grandma's house is, by God, the most important road in Mobile, Alabama. Or that transit facility, because it serves whatever, is important. Well, everything can't be important. If everything is important, then nothing's important. And so one of the real challenges from the human behavioral side is trying to identify from a community perspective what are truly your critical assets that you really need to protect in the context of potential stresses. Well, here's an example from Mobile again of, of the transit side of things. We looked at roads, transit, ports, airports, etc. On the transit side, where are there critical transit assets specifically as they relate to vulnerable populations? Those populations that don't have the ability to evacuate or don't have opportunities or could be threatened by storm surge or sea level rise or heat or whatever the case may be. So this is the type of analysis that we're seeing in many parts of the country, not all parts of the country, but as it relates to these potential risks associated with climate change and extreme weather. Here's another example from New Jersey where they defined critical facilities from a low to extreme based on subjective analysis with regard to what are the roles of those facilities in serving critical destinations, hospitals, emergency response, economic activities, government centers, etc. Vulnerability is really a critical issue, which is if you have a bridge or a culvert or a road or a transit facility, an airport that I don't care what happens, it will withstand it, then it's not highly vulnerable. I am sure, going back to the example of Chicago's air traffic control system, that before several days ago, that the FAA probably didn't think their system was very vulnerable. Well, when somebody with a lighter can walk into the air traffic control center and shut down basically the nation's system, air traffic system in the center of our country, I would say that's pretty a vulnerable system. And how you measure that, how you consider that in the context of extreme weather events and climate change in particular is really an inherent part of the transportation asset management side of things. And so there are a lot of examples from around the country, again, of how we are looking at vulnerable assets and what that means in terms of asset management systems. I love this last slide on the right because I don't own a car like that, and I guess in deep down I'm really glad that car is in there. Obviously it's an area where there's a culvert and the culvert washed out and the car, unfortunately, I guess didn't see it. But this is the type of thing that we're seeing. The culverts were the issue in Vermont. Culverts were some of the issues in other parts of the country that were facing heavy storms, flooding, etc. It's the culverts where the location was. And so how you define that vulnerability aspect from an engineering point of view in particular is an important point of departure. I think this was one of the most important slides I've seen in the last several years. I borrowed this from the Iowa Department of Transportation. Flooding in Iowa a couple years ago. This is I-680 on the left-hand side. The interstate was underwater for a month or so, a month and a half. On the right is what the road was after the water disappeared. Basically, the road no longer existed. That is a highly vulnerable asset, okay, to at least flooding in this particular case, and obviously had to be completely reconstructed after that flood dispersed. So this idea of how vulnerable an asset is really brings in your engineering expertise with regard to understanding and knowing how physical materials are going to respond to water, to temperature, to winds, etc. And that's part of how one looks at the asset system. This is kind of a busy slide, but I think it's an important one. This is a slide that we put together a couple years ago, and there are several slides like this which I did not bring, but in essence what we're talking about is what is the factor or the environmental stress factor that you're interested in. In this case it's rainfall intensity and frequency. What are the types of facilities that in fact may be affected by this pavement, foundation, etc. What's the possible effect, the weakening of the foundation roadway loss, surface deterioration, surface slope failure, etc. On the next slide is, well, what's the cause of that? Well, saturation, erosion, etc. And then the equations, which I won't bother you with, are the civil engineering equations that are used to estimate things like flow or wind speed that we use to design facilities. And what we did in this particular paper was to bring that and say, well, these are the variables that in fact will be more uncertain in the future and may be different than what we use today and from historical trends. And if we're truly trying to provide adaptive capacity in our system, maybe we should be thinking about those equations and more importantly about the values of those input variables as we go through. And just to show you, it wasn't just rain, it was also temperature rise, same concept, and then we have a lot of matrices like this for different types of environmental stressors. That same concept is used in the Federal Highway project in the Gulf Coast in Mobile, Alabama. This is from one of the reports, and again what it does is shows what you're looking at in terms of asset, what are the different, so sea level rise, precipitation, temperature, and then it keeps going. I didn't think you'd see it at all if I brought the other columns. And what is it we're currently doing with regard to design processes relating to those particular stresses on the asset, and what do we need to do differently perhaps in the future? Now, it turns out that this, I would call it growing interest. Some parts of the country are a little bit more interested in this than others. But this growing interest in extreme weather events and climate change and the impact on transportation assets happens to coincide with an interest that has been around for several years, but now because of MAP 21, which is the Moving Ahead for Progress for the 21st Century. That's your Congress in action. That's the acronym for the federal legislation. Basically says that every state DOT in the country must have a risk-based asset management system. A lot of state DOTs have had an asset management system, and I'll define what that is in a minute. But when Congress put a risk-based asset management in front of it, suddenly it was, oh my gosh, what do we mean by that? And clearly, climate change, extreme weather events is part of the risk envelope, if you will, that's associated with those types of issues. This is a definition from the federal legislation of what we mean by a transportation asset management system and process. And again, I'm not going to go through all the words, but I have in fact highlighted in red, I think, those phrases or words that are most important. It's strategic and it's systematic. DOTs are supposed to look at their infrastructure system in a very strategic way and very systematically. It's looking at maintenance issues, preservation issues, repair, rehabilitation, and replacement, to provide a state of good repair, which is to keep your system in good condition over time at the minimum practicable cost. And so this is what's meant, at least by federal legislation, and there's similar definitions that are used by state DOTs to try to monitor what's going on with their transportation system. And my argument many years ago, and now in federal legislation, not because of me, it makes common sense, I guess, is in fact there is a strong linkage between how state DOTs look at their assets and manage their assets and how you think about the risks associated with extreme weather events and climate change issues. Now, Federal Highway has provided some information with regard to the risk side of things, and I won't go into these in great detail, but clearly if you're looking at inventories, asset inventories, that needs to be put in place for an asset management system, looking at good, sound maintenance practices and a good state of good repair, and what that means in terms of the types of drainage you provide, what that means in terms of how you look at what are called ancillary assets, signs and guardrails and that type of stuff in the context of what types of stresses may be brought to bear, how you look at after effects after something happens and assets are damaged or in some way fail. What did you learn in terms of the lessons at that activity? How capable is your staff of looking at these types of things in terms of risks, asset inventories and having good unit cost data, looking at GIS, Geographic Information System capabilities as part of your asset management system, and making sure that you have a complete inventory of things like traffic control devices, signs, guardrails, and culverts. I don't know what Oklahoma DOT has, but it's been quite interesting to me based on the experience that we've seen in Vermont and other places where it's the culverts that really are the weak links in your system, and how few states actually know where their culverts are and what condition they're in, or what their maintenance record is. There are very few culvert management systems in the country. There's road management systems, there are bridge management systems. There are only a few states that I'm aware of that actually have culvert management, and in many states have hundreds of thousands of culverts, and that's the weak link in many ways. So this idea of these looking at these types of assets and what that means in terms of the damage and failure of your road, for example, in the event of some form of extreme weather event becomes important. Now, Federal Highway has also taken it upon themselves to say, well, what is this relationship between how one manages your assets in transportation and climate change and extreme weather events? And this comes from a report from the Federal Highway Administration. I'm not taking credit for this, but where they basically done is said, what are the major factors or the major sections, if you will, of a transportation asset management plan that every state DOT now is required to have, and what could you be doing on the extreme weather event or climate change side to provide input into that plan? So, for example, every plan, transportation asset management plan, should have some asset inventory and condition data associated with what's going on currently. Well, what they said is, in its relationship to climate change issues and extreme weathers, maybe you should summarize what are the climate and weather-related conditions that could affect that asset base. Maybe you should identify those changing conditions that are likely to occur in the future to kind of put that on in the minds of people of what we should be thinking about for the future asset condition. Every asset management plan should have objectives and target values or performance measures or performance metrics. And Federal Highway suggests that perhaps you should define some metrics specifically related to extreme weather events and climate change. And what are the types of assets or the network elements that in fact will be affected most by these changing conditions. With regard to performance gap measurement, and by that they mean that if you've identified your targets in terms of your condition and performance of your asset, and you assume through your analysis or based on your analysis, you know that many of your assets, critical assets, are not going to survive at some point in the future, what is that gap in terms of what the impact of a failure of your asset facility or your asset or your facility is going to mean in terms of performance to your state or community. Life cycle cost analysis, this is an important point of departure for transportation asset management systems, and this, by the way, is one of the real challenges of looking at extreme weather events and asset management from your traditional benefit cost analysis perspective. We have been struggling with this because if you're looking at life cycle in terms of the useful life of an asset, let's say you have 40 or 50 years, and you're trying to figure out with a B over C ratio, does it make sense to do anything now in the anticipation of a highly uncertain event at some point in the future, perhaps, maybe? You can use Monte Carlo simulation and all sorts of wonderful things, but it's not often a believable result for people who are struggling with how do you maintain your pavement today. And so I think this is one of the challenges that we are facing in engineering, at least, with regard to how do you put into place a B over C ratio or an economic evaluation approach to truly tell you that these are the right things to do in terms of investments. Risk management analysis, there's a difference between risk and vulnerability. Risk management basically says that there are high risks associated with a failure. So, for example, using our friends at the FAA, I'm sure they didn't think their system was very vulnerable, and I'm sure they didn't think that the likelihood of an event was very high. But boy, if something happened, there were going to be significant economic consequences, and I would call that a high-risk probability, if you will. And interfering with my travel plans, I assure you, is high risk. Because I then go in front of a video camera and proclaim to the world that the FAA, well, forget that. I won't continue that. Financial plan, every transportation asset management plan should have a financial plan associated with it. Again, here, as to what extent are you going to set aside resources to focus on these highly vulnerable, high-risk locations? What types of investment strategies are you going to use, and what are the typical approaches that you may want to think about in terms of monitoring and minimizing climate-related disruption? And then process enhancements. How are you over time going to improve your asset management system process to, again, when you have better information, better knowledge about what's actually occurring over time with regard to extreme weather and climate change? How do you incorporate that back into your ongoing improvement of your asset management system? This slide, I think, is a very interesting one, and I hope you can see it. It's probably not that visible. This comes from the United Kingdom and is what's called the Highways Agency, which is like their state DOT in England. It's not the UK, it's really England. Scotland is still part of the UK, apparently, so it's Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales, and England. This is just the England part of it. They have been, I think, one of the leaders in the world in looking at how climate change could potentially affect their operation as a, quote, state DOT, end quote. And this figure comes from their report. What this figure, in essence, is doing is they're saying they're looking at the useful life of different types of assets from 10 to 100 years, okay? And what they have up here are those types of assets like tunnels and bridges and other facilities that will be in place for a very, very long time. You build a bridge today, hopefully it will be still in place 40, 50, 60 years in the future. You build a tunnel today, you're hoping that it will still be in place 70, 80, 90 years, 100 years in the future. Versus those types of assets that they're responsible for, like car rental fleets, leasing buildings, telecommunications types of facilities that don't have that long of a useful life. And their point, which I think leads directly to the issue of asset management, is these are the ones that they need to be concerned about now. Because when you put something in place that's going to be a, if you will, heavy capital investment, heavy infrastructure, it's in place. And it will be there when things change differently 40, 50, 60 years ago, 50 years in the future. Whereas these types of things, you have time. You can wait. Every 3 or 4 years, you do a different fleet. You turn your fleet over. Every 3 or 4 years, you do a different leasing of facilities. So you can wait a little bit longer to do these types of things, but these large-scale infrastructure projects that they currently are looking at are the ones that they're focusing on in terms of design, operations, and maintenance. And that really is, I think, a very important point of departure with regard to how you look at asset management in the context of climate change and extreme weather events. Now, that's the Federal Highway Administration, and that's England. I've given literally thousands of presentations over my career. In 999 of them, I've used a triangle. I love triangles for whatever reason. I love triangles. I don't know why. Other people like triangles. One time I did not use a triangle, and somebody in the audience stood up and says, "Where's your triangle?" And I didn't realize I was doing this. He says, "I've heard you speak before, and every time you speak, there's a triangle." And so I felt bad that I didn't have a triangle on that. This is my concept of how climate change and extreme weather events really affects and can link to, if you will, asset management. What I'm trying to portray here is that there are 4 levels, if you will, of types of decision-oriented factors that you need to think about in the context of an agency and asset management. You certainly have data that you need to collect in terms of your condition and performance. You need to have performance metrics, which is this idea of performance-oriented decision-making, which is now part of federal law as well. You have objectives that you are trying to achieve in the context of your asset management system, and then you have your overall goal. And what I've done here is provided some examples of how asset management links to climate change and extreme weather events and vice versa. So for example, in the top, you could say that trying to enhance system resiliency is one of the overall goals, if you will, of your asset management system and your investment program. You could have very specific objectives oriented towards culverts or roads or bridges or transit facilities or airport facilities, whatever it is you're responsible for. You could have performance metrics that relate specifically to the types of things that you're trying to achieve, whether it's resiliency goals, whether it's recovery goals in terms of recovering from an incident as quickly as you possibly can. And then as you see, I hope you can see in the bottom, there are actually then different types of data that you would want to collect in the context of how these types of events could affect your transportation system. So this, I think, in my mind at least, sums up in a very simple way kind of this important linkage and relationship between transportation asset management and climate change and extreme weather events. Well, what do you do when it's all said and done? You go through your analysis, you have this wonderful linkage now with your asset management system, so what? What do you do about it? And there are all sorts of strategies, and I'm also known for saying one thing when people ask me a question: it all depends. That's my answer, and it's true. It all depends. It depends on what types of environmental stresses you're dealing with. It depends on the willingness of your state. And I found most recently governor's offices, that's not a comment on Oklahoma, who believe or don't believe in this, and thus state DOTs can or cannot say the term climate change. I've been to states where I'm not allowed to use that term. I'm on the university campus, which is freedom of thought, so I'm apparently I can say whatever I want to say without lightning coming down. So there are different ways of dealing with this. And so it's as simple as perhaps replacing a culvert with a wider culvert. Now, obviously, there are systems effects. I've seen people say, oh, we widened our culvert, isn't that great? Well, then the flow went through and downstream, culverts collapsed because more water was going through. So you've got to think about this very systematically. A fast recovery in terms of events that disrupt your facility. This is North Carolina, putting back in place a bridge. Anticipating events in the snow, for example, mobilizing things that state DOTs have been doing for years and probably will be doing more so in the future. I just have some examples from around the country because I thought some of you, especially if you're ODOT folks here, about how some other state DOTs are dealing with this. Vermont, because of Irene, Hurricane Irene, had serious thinking about how they design their roads. As the VTrans, Vermont Department of Transportation official told me, whereas they used to design the road and then say, oh, there's an impact on the river, they now start with the river and figure out how to put the road in there so it doesn't affect the flow of the river, because the rivers were washing away all the banks, road banks. So completely different perspective with regard, of course it's Vermont, but I'm from Wisconsin, another progressive state. So I thought this is a very interesting standing design on its head with regard to how you look at the design in this particular case of a road. Something as simply as trying to put slope stabilization in areas where you think you may have highly vulnerable areas. I'm not quite sure about this one. This is in the New York metropolitan area. This obviously is a vent cover for the subway. Obviously, with Hurricane or Superstorm Sandy, water came in, flooded the subways because it went through the vents in the station areas. And so somebody came up with this idea of coming up with this, what I consider I should be careful, unesthetic. That's a vent cover to protect water from going down the vent. I'm not so sure about that. It looks like something that people can sit on right here. It's also metal, and I can't imagine in the middle of summer sitting on that bench because of the heat. But anyway, these are things that people are thinking about to try, again, to adapt their system and in some cases to protect it. Now, assuming that there's some ODOT folks in the audience, I thought it might be interesting to look at another state DOT with regard to some of the things that they're doing outside of just asset management, but how they're thinking about changing their operations because of the types of extreme weather events and climatic changes they're expecting in the future. This is the Michigan Department of Transportation. They are expecting, because of the lake effects off of the Great Lakes, to have different storms and snowstorms in the wintertime, heat in the summer. And so what they're looking at is, well, what should we be doing differently perhaps today, if not today, in the near future with regard to how we design, operate, and maintain our assets. And so they're looking at having larger hydraulic openings for bridges over waterways, and so you don't have the erosion at the columns of the bridges, so you don't put bridge columns in the river itself. Heavier and lengthier armoring of river and stream banks, so in fact things don't erode. Looking at pavement crowns that are perhaps a little bit steeper to get the water off the pavement. Got to be a little bit careful with that from a safety perspective, but at least something that they're thinking about. Looking at different types of detention ponds with regard to higher levels of precipitation. Bridge scour, I've already mentioned that. Looking at, for those of you who are interested in landscape design, looking at using a variety of plant species for the landscape and of the roadway right-of-way. And looking at larger capacity pumps and stations where, in fact, you have floods. If you're familiar with a month or so ago, Detroit was flooded. The Detroit freeways were hit hard by a heavy storm, and if nothing else, they designed their roads in Detroit to be wonderful river channels because you saw all the land surrounding it, and there was this river down the middle, and that was a freeway. Sunken freeway design. So they're looking at having higher capacity pumps to remove that water from those freeway sections, making sure that in fact facilities are cleaned and well maintained, such as bike paths, for example. Trying to protect the workers on the construction zone, especially for higher heat temperatures. And this is something that we're seeing more and more of in the future. I think we will see in the future with regard to what you put in your contract provisions for dealing with extreme events, in this particular case, heat events. Looking at different types of materials that could in fact perform better and would have less variability with regard to weather extremes, and then going back to this roadside vegetation issue, what they call monoculture roadside vegetation that will survive longer during drought periods, which again they are expecting. So in conclusion, I think what you're seeing in the transportation side, slowly but surely, is more and more interest in terms of how do you relate and link climate change, extreme weather events, and what happens on the transportation system, and what may happen in the future to that transportation system. And my argument from a long time ago, 5 years or so ago, is that if in fact the state DOTs are interested and serious about this, one of the logical platforms for that linkage to occur is in the asset management systems. An asset management system is fairly typical. It's well known in state DOT, among state DOT staffs. There are a lot of, not a lot, but there are several state DOTs and transit agencies that are now looking directly at that relationship between asset management systems and what can you do with regard to monitoring assets over time and conditions over time, identifying vulnerabilities, identifying high-risk areas, and using that as part of then the decision-making process that state DOTs use to provide investment in terms of both maintaining the current condition as well as expanding the transportation system. So my sense is you're going to see more and more of this in the future from the state DOTs in particular. I'm glad to see that your centers are coming together. When I first started in this area or on this topic about 6 or 7 years ago, I was lucky enough to go to, and I hope I don't offend anyone, science meetings, climate science meetings. I didn't have a clue what they were talking about. We as engineers want to know at this particular location, what is it we're going to likely face in the future? And I know downscaling, I understand that. I stood up at a conference in England. There were about 400 climate scientists and 3 engineers. And I'd listened for 3 days in terms of them talking about global models and all sorts of stuff. I understand it. And I said, but what does this really mean to people out there who actually have to do something? Didn't mean that way, but actually have to provide something like infrastructure. And they looked at me as if I was from another planet. What are you here for? And I was there because I wanted to understand more about how this side of things could in fact relate to what I do and what transportation engineers do, and to what society really hopes is an infrastructure that stays in place and maintains its role as part of a community. So I think I applaud what you're doing at the University of Oklahoma, getting, if nothing else, the terminology understood between the two, and how the two can relate to really making an impact, I think is really a major step forward. So I applaud you for doing that, and thank you. 31 minutes.
So we do have time for some questions for Mike, so feel free to ask questions. Go ahead.
So Mike, it seems to me like the missing element here is the risk.
Yep.
That an extremely catastrophic event that's highly unlikely to occur. Maybe the easiest way to figure it out is let the event occur. I mean, if there's no more inexpensive way of approaching it.
Do I repeat because of the video or the question? Or is okay, let me repeat the question and just make sure. The question, if I don't get it correctly, please correct me, is with high risk but low probability events, maybe the best thing to do is just to let it occur and learn from that, and then I guess put back in place perhaps a better design or whatever the case may be. I've heard that a lot, and I got into a nasty argument with a chief engineer from a nearby state who made that argument, which in essence they were facing bridges washing out and all sorts of good stuff. And the comment that I heard was, well, we'll just let the bridge go, and then we'll use 100% federal emergency response funds and redo the bridge. Why not? And I said, well, what if somebody's on that bridge when the bridge goes down? Or what happens if that bridge is serving a community that is now isolated because they have to now go a 40-mile detour to get to where you're going, and the economic consequences of that are quite high. So we got into a big debate and argument about it. I think there are, I guess, pros and cons on each side. As an engineer and as a planner, I've spent more time planning than engineering. I would argue that if you can identify areas where there are high risks associated with things like this, and you can figure out a way to deal with these things in a cost-effective way, that I don't see why, in fact, you wouldn't do something to try to minimize the disruption that's going to occur. Now, what I often hear is, we don't have the money. You know, I've given a lot of talks around the country to a lot of state DOT folks, and usually there's dead silence at the end of my talk, and then someone is courageous enough to say, you're talking about us spending money on stuff that we don't have the money for. We can't even maintain our existing system. What are you doing? And that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying, I think, well, no, not I think, I know. What I'm saying is that having been in a state DOT, and I understand the pressures that state DOTs are under from a financial perspective, it seems to me that if you've identified an area, whether it's a river basin or whether it's a coastal area, whatever the case is, where there's high vulnerability and high risks associated with an extreme weather event, that as you go through the normal rehabilitation reconstruction process over the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years, that if you're in one of those areas and for a marginal incremental cost you can make that culvert 4 feet rather than 3 feet, that you would do that. Because in the event that something would occur, that additional foot in diameter, maybe, will in fact handle the flow that otherwise may not be handled. And that it's very difficult to quantify, and I know a lot of people are thinking about it, it's very difficult to say, well, why should you do that? I think it makes sense to do it in the context of trying to minimize future disruption and future economic consequences. I have, and I shouldn't do this, but I'll do it because people laugh every time I do it. I have what I call the pepperoni pizza anchovy map or concept, and which relates directly to this issue. Pretend like the state of Oklahoma is a pizza, okay, and it's covered with cheese. And every now and then you have slices of pepperoni around the state. And then you have anchovies, which happen to go along your rivers, in my case, along the coasts. And so what is that? That basically means that I am not in any way suggesting to ODOT or to change everything you're doing. I am not suggesting you change your design standards. I'm not suggesting you change your procedures. What I am suggesting is that if you find yourself in a pepperoni slice in your state as you're redesigning a road or designing a new road, you should be asking yourself the question, well, wait a minute, maybe we shouldn't use the traditional approach in this particular design. Maybe we should be doing something a little bit different to anticipate future consequences. Then it's a decision. I mean, then it's basically a decision on the part of whoever makes the decision of what it is that you want to do. So I'm not, we call them design exceptions when I was in Massachusetts. I don't know what you call them in Oklahoma. But I'm not saying change your design standard. I'm simply saying if you're in one of those areas that's highly vulnerable and there are high risks associated with failure or disruption, think about it a little bit differently. Now, I'll have to say that in coastal areas where you have storm surge and sea level rise, it's a little bit different issue than it is here, where in fact I think the storm surges from Hurricane Sandy, obviously in New York, and Hurricane Katrina were incredibly damaging, and people get it in terms of we need to think differently. But I honestly believe that from an engineering perspective that we can anticipate in those areas where there's pepperoni slices, in those areas where in fact the process may be a little bit different. I have to say, and I feel sorry for the folks in New York and New Jersey and Connecticut with Superstorm Sandy, but as I'm sure all of you were watching the TV of what was going on, when Governor Cuomo stood up in front of a TV camera, like I said, the day or so after Superstorm Sandy, and he said, he faced the camera, national news, he said, we need to rethink how we design our transportation system. I screamed. I went, yes, finally, somebody in an elected position who finally not agrees with me, he didn't know who I am, but finally someone who gets it in terms of maybe we should be doing things a little bit differently in areas that are likely going to be hit in the future over than what we've done before. That is an incredibly long-winded answer to your question, but it was a question that I get all the time. I don't know if I answered it or not, but that's my thought on that. Yes?
Dr. Meyer, do you feel like, based on your exposure to the state DOTs, you feel like there is a kind of a shift in terms of the research methodologies and the research approaches of DOTs in this regard?
On this issue? The question is, do I feel like there's a shift in research methodology or research approaches, or even allowing such research to go forward under the state DOT from what I've... And I hate to say this, but it all depends. There are some states, like Washington State, for example, that has in fact put a fair amount of money, research money, in looking at these issues of climate change and extreme weather events and what that means in terms of transportation. California is another state that's doing that. There are other states that I'm very familiar with that are there's a state that I'm very familiar with that when I happened to be at that university, there were, I think, like 25 research proposals that went from my transportation center. Out of the 25, mine was on climate change and impact. And all it was really was to take a look at what other states are doing. Not saying anything, just don't you want to know what Washington State is doing and Maryland is doing and Massachusetts is doing. It was ranked number 25 out of 25, okay? Now, I also had 1, 2, and 3, so that's fine too, but okay. The next year, I submitted the exact same proposal, exact. But instead of the term climate change, I said, potential impacts of perhaps maybe someday weather might be different, sometime in the future when we may all be dead, but who knows? Ranked number 1. So, I mean, it's a lot of mindset associated with whether this is a worthy cause or not. But I am starting to see more and more state DOTs at least acknowledge that there's a potential research question here that relates to what they do. But I don't see a groundswell at this point in time. But there are examples around the country where that in fact has occurred, where research is being done by their state universities on topics similar to what you saw earlier on the list here. I saw a hand, yes.
Yeah, you talked about the engineering solutions,
Yep.
asset management.
Yep.
What about the policy side? Because some highways probably shouldn't be built where they are built. And also maybe the river should be flooded. You should have a floodplain, not build levees and things like that.
Politics are always part of what happens. Another unnamed eastern state that I went and spoke at to their state DOT because I was using them as a case study for this report. I shouldn't say that because now you know probably at least you have 1 or 3 chances of guessing who it was. But it was a coastal state, which now narrows it down to 1, where in fact they had some islands off the coast of that state that were highly tourist-oriented, high development potential. And there was a proposal to build a bridge to an island that every climate model at that state university said would be underwater in about 40 years. And I suggested to them that it might not make the most sense to do that. Maybe a ferry system would be better. And the response I got was no, that the development community felt that that was an area where, in fact, they would want to kind of partake of that potential, and there were politics, if you will, involved with that situation. I not only was I am a transportation engineer, but back in the day in Massachusetts, I was also chairman of my town planning commission. And when I was the state DOT person with the state DOT hat on, I would be sitting there going, you need to do this, you don't understand, this is a congestion and you guys are making bad decisions on the land use side and whatever the case is. Then when I went and chaired the town planning commission, I put my planning hat on, the state DOT people from my agency would come and say, you guys are terrible, you don't understand, it's the prerogative of my town to do what it wants to do. Where you sit is where you stand, as the phrase says. I don't think there's any question that there are issues associated from planning and land use decisions. the whole concept of FEMA floodplains and, insurance and what that means with regard to those types of decisions. There are now questions in some states about whether you disinvest in roads, for example, that are already washing away. Do you just replace them with more protection at a higher elevation and embankments, or do you just say, look, we're not going to serve that area anymore, we can't? There's at least one state on the East Coast that is seriously thinking about disinvesting in some of their coastal areas because they just don't think they can, A, rebuild, and more importantly, probably maintain some of their roads that are now already washing away because of tidal influences, et cetera. So those are very important questions, and I didn't talk about them because I really was looking at asset management more than anything else. But clearly how we design our communities, the types of decisions that relate to development, the types of decisions that relate to vulnerable populations, where we put our critical facilities, where we put our schools, where we put our hospitals, where we put our government centers, all that kind of has to be part of this bigger picture. And so I agree with you that in many cases this becomes a much broader issue than just simply transportation asset management. In fact, it has to be a broader issue than just that. And when you broaden the issue to that, you then automatically get involved in politics. But I was a political appointee for 5 years and survived Massachusetts politics quite well, thank you, and I love it. And so it was an interesting experience, but also showed me that side of how influence occurs with regard to what really happens in the world. One final question, and I'll quit, I think, right?
Sure.
Yeah, sure, yes.
This is kind of along the same lines, but in your statement of the legislation,
Yeah.
there's the word strategic.
Yep.
Was there ever any statement of congressional intent what they mean by strategic?
We are talking about Congress now, we're talking about, God, you're going to erase this from the video, right? I know there was no definition in the congressional record either in terms of what is meant by strategic. If I had to put words in their mouth, it was systematic, which means you're looking at it in a very systematic way. And strategic, I would argue, is really from the perspective of you can't protect everything. And what are your critical assets as it relates to the role or the function they play in terms of broader issues, the economy and quality of life and all sorts of good things. So I think strategic in the sense is really targeting your limited investment on those things that really matter. I suspect that's really what they meant by that. I am not going to put words in a congressional committee's mouth. I mean, that's...
So is it left up to the individual DOTs to decide what that is?
Yes. As usual, a requirement like this, the requirement for a transportation asset management plan and the requirement for a risk-based asset management system is there. But the Federal Highway Administration will look at it and say, yes, no, more than likely, yes. But I've already seen several states that have come up with their system. There's a guidelines already, guidance, if you will. The regulations haven't come out yet officially. But there's some guidelines in terms of here is what a plan should look like. And not surprisingly, every state DOT I've seen so far has, their plan looks just like it's organized along those lines. Some states, from the strategic perspective, some states have said, hey, the legislation says bridge and roads on what's called the National Highway System. Other states have said, you know what, culverts are important. And they've expanded it to beyond just roads and bridges because from a strategic perspective, they have decided that they want to do that. Other states have said not just culverts, it's traffic signals, it's lighting, it's everything else. So they've expanded it beyond that because their decision makers decided that that's part of the transportation system, that if those things go down, although they may be able to be replaced quickly, they're still part of the safety of using that system. So strategic is very much in the sense that what's part of the system may vary from state to state. But what that plan looks like, I think you're going to see a lot of familiar elements from state to state just because of federal guidance.
Mike, I'd like to just make one comment.
This is not part of my time, by the way.
Right. We talk about the duty, but I think I would say that in case of SPTC, duty is playing a very important role by giving us match funds and giving us a lot of flexibility in terms of which project to pick. I would like to, in addition to Oklahoma DOT providing a significant level of match, Louisiana is providing match. New Mexico is providing match. They're all partners, but I think we also have to take our part in terms of establishing this dialogue
Oh, absolutely. Yeah,
Actually
sure.
understanding terminology. I think this is very, very important, and I think we should do more of the type of thing that we are doing today. You know, we have cohabited with the climate people here at OU for a long time, but we still have not talked really. So I think this type of dialogue is very important, and what you conveyed is extremely important. So thank you. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. I'm assuming I don't have to repeat that, so. I guess that's it then?
Yeah.
All right, well, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Mike, for an outstanding presentation.